Well, it's 9:01. Let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jedediah Rogers. I'm co-editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to be able to welcome and host this session, which is part of our Utah State Historical Society 125th anniversary speaker series. So thank you for being a part of this evening. Wherever you may be listening or watching the session. Although we are gathered virtually, we still want to make room for some participation. And so the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, that would be the place to type your questions if you have any for the panelists. And we'll try to get to those by the end of the session tonight. And we'll be running until we've scheduled until about 8:15 or so. So the topic on race and housing is always timely, but the impetus for the conversation tonight stems from the research or personal and family experiences of our panelists. And Tanya Ryder is an independent historian whose work on Utah's Black communities has appeared in the Utah Historical Quarterly and the Journal of Mormon History. Back in 2017, we published her Utah Historical Quarterly piece titled Red Slave Histories, Family, Race, and Sex in Pioneer Utah. And then the latest issue of the journal features Tanya's wonderful article titled Not in My Neighborhood, the 1939 Controversy Over Segregated Housing in Salt Lake City. So I want to thank Tanya for her thoughtful approach to history and for introducing me to our next two panelists, who I'll introduce right now. Nicole Bordeaux has over 20 years experience working in public administration. She currently serves as a planning and engagement officer for the Utah Transit Authority. Previously, she was deputy chief of staff for Mayor Ralph Becker in Salt Lake City, and before then, deputy director of housing and neighborhood development for the Salt Lake City Corporation. Ms. Bordeaux is also active in the community, including serving on the Utah Museum's advisory board. So it's great to be with you, Nicole.
Thank you.
And then it's an honor to be with Kellen Perkins. He is a native Utahn. He spent the majority of his life in Salt Lake County and Summit County. His interest and knowledge surrounding the world of real estate, because he's works as a real estate agent, comes from having been born into one of Utah's first Black entrepreneurial families who own farms, commercial complexes, multifamily units, and a variety of single-family homes. So, and Kellen and Nicole know each other well, family sorts. We'll be hearing more about that here in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Tanya to kick us off. So thank you, Tanya.
Thanks. And thanks for Kellen and Nicole joining us tonight. It means a lot to all of us. I don't want to talk a lot about the actual ins and outs of my article, but I do want to say a few things that came to light. As I began to think about writing about this segregated housing controversy that took place in 1939, I hoped that I could produce a more complete account of what happened and also why it happened. And I wanted to discover, if possible, some of the motivations of Sheldon Brewster and his neighbors in the Sumner neighborhood. I also wanted to find contemporaneous accounts of the struggle between the two groups and see more about the Black community's response to the demands for segregation. And as it turns out, the story is always more complicated the more you dig into things, it seems. And there were many twists and turns to the episode, and there were some details that I'm not sure I'll ever completely be sure that we sorted out. But hopefully, I've been able to clarify and explore some of the misunderstandings and the competing demands that were at issue in Salt Lake, and I discovered at the same time in Ogden. One aspect of the notorious incident remains really clear. White residents called for their city leaders to limit the areas open to Black occupancy, and in the case of Salt Lake, they called for the creation of a Black housing district. despite the fact that Black families had lived all over the valley for decades. So the 1939 event has been noted in histories of Utah and is probably the most recognized attempt to segregate housing in our state. But in fact, it was not the first and it was not the last time when steps were taken to keep neighborhoods all white. I live in a neighborhood named Crystal Heights. It's southeast of Sugar House. And to get to my house, I often turn east off 13th East and drive on a beautiful tree-lined street called Stratford Avenue, where stately old homes sit well back on large lots. As we get closer to my house, things change, and the houses are newer, much smaller, and we're a later addition to the original Highland Park development that I passed through. Jed, do you have the slide for Highland Park advertising? Maybe not.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll put it up if
you can. Okay. In 1909, when Kimball and Richards bought the unapproved land where they planned to build this country neighborhood, they wanted to appeal to buyers of means, professionals and businessmen and their families, people who had money to invest in large homes and didn't want to see their property values reduced by unregulated building. The Kimball and Richards sales pitch assured prospective buyers that when they bought a lot in this new neighborhood, no one would build unsightly shacks next door. Garages could not be built closer than 90 feet from the street. And they planned for a small business section of 2 blocks that would house all the commercial enterprises allowed in the subdivision. Buyers would escape the noise and smoke of downtown, but that was not all they could avoid. In an ad they ran in the Salt Lake Tribune on January 19th, 1919, the developers promised, quote, "Only members of the Caucasian race are permitted to buy and hold property," unquote. Polly Hart, who nominated Highland Park as a National Historic District, found these advertisements, and she also found that all the deeds were later amended to include that racial restriction. Kimball and Richards also built Gilmer Park, which is just south of East High and west of 13th East. In March of 1919, an advertisement they placed in the Tribune told prospective buyers that they could find in Gilmer Park fine lots. They're large enough to ensure plenty of sunshine and fresh air on all 4 sides of every home. And because of the proper building regulations, which safeguard every home site, they will become more attractive and more valuable as the years go by. One of these regulations, again, ensured that only members of the Caucasian race will ever be permitted or to buy or hold property in Gilmer Park. Kimball and Richards were not the first land development firm to write restrictive covenants. Polly Hart also notes that restrictive covenants began as early as 1890, and they were not racial ones, but rather ones to limit the type of building allowed. It wasn't until 1914 that racial restrictions appeared when the Dunshee brothers built the neighborhood of Westmoreland. Even after the city attorney ruled against the call for a segregated district in 1940, real estate developers and agents attempted to carve out all white areas of the city using racial covenants. In other cases, established residents made it difficult for newcomers who were people of color. A Japanese American family lived 2 doors down from my childhood home in Rose Park. Rose Park, in case you don't know, sits on the northwest part of the valley, really the northernmost part of the valley, Salt Lake County, rather. When we moved into Rose Park, I became friends with 2 girls in this family, and I recently learned from one of them that their mother and father had settled on buying a different home in the area in about 1952. Their mother was scrubbing the kitchen floor in preparation for the family moving in when their real estate agent showed up at the door and told them that they could not have this house after all. The neighbors had gotten together and they had opposed a Japanese family living next to them. The realtor found the home for them on my street and told everyone they were Hawaiian, which apparently made a difference. No one objected to their occupying that home, and 70 years later, the mother still lives in that house. As far as I know, Rose Park had no restrictive covenants written into the deeds, but discrimination still existed. You know, growing up in Salt Lake, I, like many others, really wasn't aware of housing or racial restrictions or housing restrictions. And it wasn't until I began studying Utah's Black history about 20 years ago that I learned about the 1939 controversy and these other attempts to keep neighborhoods all white. Early on in my effort to understand the lives and experiences of Utah's earliest Black residents, I found some collections of oral histories. The Marriott Library Special Collections at the U of U holds a number of oral histories by Black Utahns. And in addition, BYU's L. Tom Perry Special Collections in the Lee Library and the Church History Library hold a few of them. I really fell in love with these oral histories as I started to read them. The reason I think they're so important is that they allow us to hear the voices of the interviewees. They're immediate, they're unpolished, and sometimes they're frustrating because I want to ask questions the interviewer doesn't ask. I think I first learned about the 1939 episode reading Mary Lucille Perkins' Bankhead's histories. Nicole's just told us tonight that she was actually there during one of these oral histories as it was being recorded. Her account, Mary Lucille Perkins Bankhead's account of what happened, is central to understanding both the facts and how the Black community responded in 1939. Okay, now for a little bit of ancient history. Utah's population has traditionally been made up of people of British, Scandinavian, and Western European descent. The Black population has been very small, amounting to only 1% of the total by even 2010. Many of the original Black settlers were enslaved to Mormon converts. Many people listening tonight probably know the name of Jane Manning James, who was a devout Black convert and who with her family came to Salt Lake as a free woman. But since the Black population was so very small, members of the early families intermarried. Mary Lucille Perkins had roots in the Green Flake, Frank Perkins, and Jane Manning James families. And then when she married Thomas Leroy Bankhead, she married into a family who were descended from another early Black enslaved family, the Bankheads. In 1888, Jane James's son, Sylvester James, bought a tract of farmland in Mill Creek after the Chambers and Legrone families had begun farming there. Sylvester Perkins, Lucille's father, bought a portion of the James land in 1893, so Lucille Perkins was born on that land in Mill Creek, and she lived there her entire life, surrounded by her extended family. Her oral histories, together with those of other members of the family, brought their experiences to life. And through those pages, I felt I got to know people that I never could meet. Cliche or not, Lucille came to life in those interviews. I sensed her strength, her pride, and her common sense approach to living. She told about when, in the fall of 1939, she heard that someone was trying to force all the Black families and residents of Salt Lake County to sell their homes and relocate to an area just south of downtown Salt Lake. Lucille Bankhead was having none of that. She and several members of her sewing club organized a protest and went downtown in a horse and wagon in a wagon pulled by a horse to voice their opposition. They intended to retain their property. They'd owned it for many decades and were not letting it go. Her vivid retelling of the story made a big impression on me. Her fierce defense of her rights as a property owner shines through her narrative. It was not until many years after I first heard of this woman that I realized that I had known a few members of her extended family, actually since high school. Several years ago, I reached out to one of them, Nicole's stepmother, in fact, and she was kind enough to introduce me to other members of the family. They welcomed me as if I am one of the family. I don't know if I've adopted them or they've adopted me, but either case, it's good to be. It's been an honor and it's been a privilege to spend time with them. I've heard about their family histories. I've learned about their legacy and the pride that they have in their family heritage. Their ancestors have not received the recognition many other pioneers have received through the years, but that's beginning to change, and it's long overdue. Nicole and Kellen have graciously agreed to participate tonight so they can talk about their family history and their perspectives on the Black experience in Utah. Nicole, would you like to say anything at this point?
Well, all I would say is thank you. And yes, we have adopted you and we're glad you've adopted us. I think, you know, to your point, and we can talk about Lucille later, but I take pride in the fact that both Kellen and I really value where we live in the state of Utah. And we know that's historical in our family roots. And I find it interesting that we both work in areas of land use, planning, and housing and transportation, and really those fundamental values that we saw coming from our family. So I'm excited to answer anyone's questions. I can tell you about Lucille. I think I have her spit and fire a little bit in me and gets me in trouble sometimes, but I'm happy to be here and really answer any questions people have about my family and also the work that, you know, I'm doing to help keep that legacy alive.
Well, speaking of the legacy, did the memory of that 1939 event, I assume it lived on in your family. Did you guys talk about it through the years?
You know, I think the most that we heard was her protectedness of land, of her area, of what was hers or ours, because it was really ours. We think of the Legrones and, you know, we were all one big family there. And I don't remember hearing that particular story until I started reading, because like you said, I was there at one of these oral histories, and another one, I think I met Dr. Coleman as a young girl, and I just didn't understand why she was telling me. Why did they come see her it was like every time there's some new researcher there. But I think what it kind of cemented in me was understanding that that was a pride in her and that this is where it came from. So once I started researching it like you, after she was gone, like, what did they say? What did she say? That's when I learned more about that piece, but particularly that incident.
Well, the Mill Creek area is interesting because, you know, correct me if you have a different perspective, but it seems to me that there were never really enough Black people in Salt Lake for a period of time, maybe in the late 1800s when the soldiers were here, it seems like there was quite a bit going on. There were 4 Black newspapers, there were some other things, but after that, it doesn't seem like there was ever really a consolidated Black community in Salt Lake. But I attempted to say that Mill Creek kind of is that place to a small extent, because there were so many in the family that lived there.
I think that, so I would think for me, and we talked about a little bit what the Utah multicultural piece is looking at, but I've always said, you know, I'd go to other cities and there was a concentrated Black community. And so I felt like there was family, but then really when you wanted to meet people still in the Black race, there, Ogden, you had the west side of Salt Lake City, if you had Latino community. So it was very diverse to me that there wasn't really a Black community like you would see in a large metropolitan community like California, for instance. I was like, oh, this is different. Growing up, born and raised in Utah, I saw a significant difference. But, you know, so we always saw as this is just the family, you know, but I can see why that would be concentrated. I mean, at one point, probably even before our time, there were several families in that area that, you know, and descendants that had that property there.
Yeah. And happily, at least one descendant still lives on Evergreen Avenue.
Yeah,
right?
actually, I think 2. So we have the Legrones, and then my cousin, who is my first cousin, lives in a portion of Lucille's original property. Yep.
Oh, that's great. I know. I like the continuity, especially now. So, Kellen, did you had an experience that you wanted to talk about, I think, about housing and your family's personal experience with that?
Oh, there's a lot of experiences. I could talk about housing.
Yes.
So, I mean, again, going to your point about community, and I think one of the things Nicole kind of talked about is us viewing the Mill Creek, the whole Mill Creek area on Evergreen Avenue as one family. My memories from that are, the family reunions that we have. We basically had one big block party and tents, and Mary Lucille's property, along with her brother, who was my great-grandfather's property, became one large plot, and people were running all over. So that is a memory I have that speaks to what you point out as community. It's interesting that you talked about Rose Park earlier, because that's where I grew up, and then would spend time going to what they called the country, because that's what Mill Creek was going out to the country.
Yeah.
And being a Rose Parker and living close to the city, I never thought I never thought too much about the lack of diversity in the city until my latter years, where we moved to Harvard Yale. And then I started learning about the covenants that were in that area that you speak of. And then I later learned through my real estate career, Rose Park actually did have those covenants. And I think
did they?
talked about them in the past. Similar covenants, which is very interesting because, as you know, it's now one of the most diverse areas of town.
Yeah.
Which could be celebrated, but it's also goes back to the 1939 incident, right? Like, eventually, it wasn't incidents that like you experienced where they wouldn't sell to a Japanese family. It was the only place that they would sell to people of color, or attempted to get people of color to go to. And Nicole and I have talked a lot offline about redlining and the different ways that happened in our city. It happened then, and unfortunately, I'd hate to say it still happens now, in different ways. It comes out in different ways in my industry. And because of those incidents, I would say that there's been a lot of stuff. If we go back to going back to 1939 and beyond, and then coming forward, and then looking at the stuff that was happening and looking at the segregation and the items that we've talked about, you'll see that it's created a large gap in generational wealth, even for those who've been here. Nicole and I are lucky enough to come from the family that we do. We talked about the Black community. A lot of the Black community ended up in Ogden because they came with the railroad, and property values there are significantly different than what they are in Salt Lake County. So when you look at these issues and you take them back to what happened in 1939, we've got a real ugly history here, and something that I think some are willing to acknowledge. And Nicole can speak of that, working on the inner workings. But I think also, from my perspective and working in the industry I work in, I think there are a lot of people who don't see the repercussions of our previous actions. And when I say I mean our societies, of course.
I just like to add on to that, if I could. One of the things I think Kellen brings out is, and one thing you brought up, Tanya, is that we've owned land, and also we've come from free Blacks before Emancipation Proclamation, and that to me is a privilege that not all Blacks in this community or others have had. Kellen and I are both lucky to be as successful as we are, but there are a lot of reasons behind that. He can talk about his grandparents. Most of the women in our family read and could write, and went to school, had access to education and home ownership or land ownership. And that's where the wealth and the privilege and what's helped us get to where we are. So I think people think, well, we're all fine now, but there's a reason why, and not everybody had those opportunities, to your point.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, oh, go ahead, Tanya.
Well, go ahead. You say first.
I was going to say, I'd like to add that this is not exclusive to, we're all very well aware that this has happened all over the country. But Nicole and I were talking earlier today about the fact that one of the ways that it's happened is through planning and zoning, and also through adding things through transportation and adding train tracks. You talk about Rose Park, you know that if you go from Rose Park to Poplar Grove, you hit a train track. If you try to hit Rose Park to downtown, there's a train track.
Right.
So you're locked in to one section of the town, and that has been prohibitive for many people in general, but many people of color, because this is where the communities have landed.
When you were talking about land ownership, it reminded me that in the collection of oral histories at the U, the man's name escapes me right this minute, but he was a young man who met Mary Lucille Perkins Bankhead's children. I think somehow they either knew each other from school, or I don't know if any of those kids boxed together, but anyway.
Oh, they did box. My great uncle was in Golden Gloves. So yeah, he did box.
So somehow they knew them, and this young man had come from outside of Utah, and he and his mother had come to Utah and settled here, and he was invited out to the Bankhead property in Mill Creek, where he would sit. He said it was idyllic for him because he could run. The boys would just run wild on this big lot, and they would be out all afternoon, just doing all kinds of, just fun boy stuff. And he said it hit him that he had never known Black people who had home and land ownership where he had come from. And that even later on as an adult, he thought that was such a fundamental thing for him to learn, that it was possible. And that's what they stood for. The Bankhead stood for him.
I love that story. And I think, I told you I grew up with Lucille all the time, Perkins. She was my great grandmother. I was with her. She watched me basically while my mother was working. So I was with her on weekends, and I loved to stay with her. And there's something about having that land. And she would tell me about Mill Creek that went through the back of the LaGrone's house. That would go there, and they'd have asparagus and raspberries and currants. And to Kellen's point, we really did run free. Like I was back and forth, and having access to nature as well. I know, that it's a thing that I would just go climb a tree all day, and then she'd make me pick apricots. But there's something about that not a lot of people of color or have access to that, or have had land that is kind of nature. They fished, right out of there. There was tons of gardening and fruit orchard that I hate, but all of that. And there was still a irrigation that she was pulling when I was little to get water in there. So I get to that point about having access. And I think we're privileged to have that. I never know not owning property. My grandparents, all of them owned it. So it is something that we need to think about, and it does go for generational wealth. I do want to second that on Kellen's point.
Yeah, and I think the land, running wild on that land was something that has carried down through the generations. Even myself, I took out a bush, running crazy and playing tag. I think I was 7 and I was washing cars, and I accidentally hit the car in a drive. And there was a shrub that went between my great-grandparents' house and Nicole's great-grandparents' house. And I ran over, fully over a section of that. And you would have thought I murdered someone.
Oh yeah, trouble.
Because there was such pride in this land. I'm a Mill Creek resident now. And I will tell you, and I think, Tanya, you were there when they honored another one of our family members and gave us a fine, and, where the city center is going to go. And there is something special about being here in Mill Creek, and seeing what's going on, seeing that they're trying to make some changes. over 150 years later, after our family has been here, there's still so much change that needs to be made. That is both empowering and sad. You know, it's just part of our evolution as humans to understand. I listened to Angela Davis give a speech once, and she said, whenever there's a movement, you have to look backwards to see who's left behind. And I feel that we're starting to come to the head where we're really looking or attempting to look at who's come behind. And as we look at housing prices being, you know, the highest that they've been in decades, it's really important for us to look at our previous history and where we've been and how we can avoid doing that in the future so that we can avoid creating, as we're looking for options for affordable housing, tackling zoning laws and access for everyone, we have to be careful, and we have to keep going back to stories like, you know, the 1939 incident so that we can avoid having things like that happen in the future.
The event that Kellen refers to is the Mill Creek mayor and probably a committee decided that they wanted to honor one of the Black farmers, Samuel Chambers, who had been a real feature of Mill Creek for many, many years. He and his wife, Amanda, came from the South and built a very successful farm, grew a lot of berries, from what I understand, a lot of currants. And so they decided, that Mill Creek decided to name one of the main streets in the new development Chambers Avenue, and invited some of the Chambers descendants, of which Kellen and Nicole are to come to that event too.
Yeah.
Kellen, I wanted to ask you something else, because it's a year old, a year and a half old, but I noticed a little blurb in KSL News that said a woman had discovered that her deed in Ogden had racial restrictions in it, and her intent was to get those removed. And I think she mentioned a bill or a new Utah state law that made that possible. I think her deed was from 1948, and it was near Harrison Avenue in Ogden. Do you ever run into that when you're doing real estate? Have you?
Every day, every day. In fact, if you ever sign on a loan with the title company, you know, when you sign, every title company has a form that you have to sign that recognizes that there's language in the covenants that no longer applies today, that is illegal for them to enforce, but it's there. You have to acknowledge that you know it's there. And now people are creating laws and attempting to create laws to get rid of the language completely, get rid of the covenants, and require cities and neighborhoods to redo them. And there's been controversy around that, because some people say it doesn't matter. You know, it's from the past. Why should it matter? And then there's those of us who, are privileged enough that we look at the fact that, you know, Nicole and I have kids that are the same age, and when they buy a home, they're going to have to see this language, and it's going to have to explain again. And it's just kind of a lot of people don't understand generational pain. And that is something that we experience daily when we talk about these issues. The other side of my family is from the South, my father's side. And I've spent a lot of time going down there. And when I was going to one of their properties, they told me not to drive at night because of a sundown town. I'm from Utah. I'd forgotten what that was. And then we got to talking about how property ownership is down there. And Nicole and I have had conversations with, as you know, knowing the history of our family, there's a section of our family that did not get freed and did not come to Utah. And the life down there is so different. So when we talk about these issues in Salt Lake, this is just a minor, it's major, but it's a minor scope of what was happening all over the country. You know, I spent, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
No, I was just gonna add, go ahead. I was gonna add to something, but go ahead.
Oh, so I mean, in issues like this, we look at Salt Lake has been one city that has done it. I spent 2 months in Dallas last year and learned a lot about how they segregated neighborhoods. Even there's a neighborhood called Staten Island, and it was where the wealthy Blacks lived. But when segregationists started coming in and saying, no, we don't want this area, they put freeways through it. And that has been pretty common throughout our history. And if you start going through and looking at how neighborhoods of people of color are segregated, you'll see those freeways just about in any city you go to. In St. Louis, you're let off at the freeway where they only let Blacks live.
I was just going to comment on one thing about the covenants. And this is even personally for me, living where I do, and then speaking to other people of color who want to leave those covenants as a record in there so that we don't forget that this is the history, right? So that, and I understand the trauma, like Kellen said, it is there, but there are people that want it there so that we don't forget of what we did in the past. So I think it's kind of a twofold. I have a copy of the covenants for this area so that I remember that at one point in time, I'm not supposed to be here. And I think it's just important for me to understand who and all the sacrifices that had to be made to even get me to my point, right? It's not just I showed up and life was wonderful. There was a lot of sacrifices and a lot of work from my family to get here. And the other thing I was just going to point on transportation and transit, of course, is near and dear to my heart. We really, even in the state and everywhere, and I will have to say, you know, I support this administration with the federal government is really looking at these things. And with the infrastructure bill, if it passes with the budget, there is a provision that you can take out these barriers to communities and produce equity. So things like rail stations that circle communities of color or low-income communities. So to Kellen's point is we are moving forward. I think this is really at the forefront of the inequities that we've set from our history and how we can change our transportation, change our housing and our planning so that we don't set it up for the future and continue, because it's a continuous process. So I just want to touch on those two things.
That is great. Total change of direction for just a second here. Your great grandma, great aunt talked about belonging to the Camellia Arts Club. Do you know anything about that club? I've asked a few people in the family, and I get the idea it was maybe a sewing club, but do you know any more than that?
I don't know any more than a sewing club. What I can tell you about Lucille is, you know, not knowing this as a kid, but knowing art was important to her. So I had, even in her elderly years, I would go with her and we'd go to community centers and she would do painting. And then she did quilting. Like she always had those big quilt racks up. So I think it was a quilting circle, that community. But one thing about her, she set those things up a lot. Like she was one of, you know, the first relief societies for the Black community. So could have been something she set up that with the community. I just want to be honest. I know that's who she was, right? Like, but I was looking it up to see what the reference was to, you know, I know she worked with the Gregory Center, if you're familiar with where that is. Yep, she was part of getting that up. And I thought that's where it was. But this is all by pulling it out of my brain. So I don't, you know, we'd have to do a lot of work on that. But
go ahead.
Yeah, I will tell you that art was really important to her. One of the last things, you know, as she was passing, she did those California raisins and painted them. And I thought it was going to be World War III between my great aunt and uncles about who got these, like, you know what I mean? These ceramic things. But I think,
California raisins.
yeah, they were like painted, but this is going back into the 80s, but it was just hilarious that they were fighting, not over property, not over China, over the California raisins. So I think art was a big part of her life.
Yeah, throughout the family, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you've done a good job of answering this question already, but Jed wanted to ask you about how your pioneer ancestry, how your family history and your roots, you've talked a little bit about that, but do you think that those things have really influenced what you are doing now with your lives? You've kind of hit on that, but tell us a bit more if you can.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about, I think it's emboldened me. And I think that's allowed me to be really involved. But you heard my jobs. They all circle around really caring for this community and thinking about, my fourth great grandfather coming here with the pioneers and settling the land. I feel like that is kind of intrinsically in me. I care about Salt Lake City. I care about how community is built. And I think that all comes from knowing all the work and struggle that got us here. And, I have lived in North Carolina, and that's where actually Green Flake was from. And it's a different community. Kellen alluded to this. And so a lot of it is me accepting the gifts that I had and the opportunities I had based on all that family moving and doing the hard work. Because as you know, it was hard work, and they didn't have the life I have. So I think it has set me in there, and to really respect land, respect that, it was taken land. We didn't come here to nobody, right? We have our Native American indigenous people that were living here, but just respecting that and respecting what it takes to hopefully have a future for other people that want to be here. It's a beautiful place. So I think that's really what I see, is how much I care for nature and where we live.
Thanks. Jed, were you saying something?
Well, no, this has been terrific. Thank you so much. Maybe to continue on with that last question. I mean, you've referenced generational wealth. You've referenced generational pain. There's a wonderful image that we published in Tanya's article that shows 3 or 4 generations of Bankheads.
Yeah.
So I'm just struck by this family in particular has sort of generational memories, right, going back. And I think you've spoken a bit to that. How do you maintain that as an extended family that has obviously grown? Not everyone, I assume, lives now in Mill Creek. How do you continue to maintain those deep ties that you've created over the generations?
I think this is a great question for Kellen too. It's hard. We're gonna have Tanya help us. What's the biggest struggle for me is I was really at that gap from my great grandmother. And so I saw the older generation, Kellen too, at the end. But, we had family reunions of 200 people, and we were, he's my third cousin, but he's my cousin. And so we were so connected and know everybody and where everybody is. I think that's hard for me to let go of people that are in their 20s. And I don't know, my other cousins. And I think to your point, it's really a struggle. I think we've tried to make sure we have a reunion. It's important to my family. It's important to my cousins. Kellen knows that we're trying to make sure that we keep that legacy, and hopefully people come and want to learn more about where they come from. I think it's just really important. Kellen?
I agree. I have to agree 100% with what Nicole just said. I mean, Jed, more to the point, we tend to host a large family reunion every 3 years or so.
Tanya's been there.
Tanya's been to a couple of them now. And we try to make the event where it would be enjoyable for everyone. So from young to old, from those who are, more economically blessed to those who might be challenged. We try to make it something that has a little bit of everything. We've gone on cruises with 100 and, how many, Nicole? There were 114 of us on that cruise, I think, something like that. You know, we've had barbecues here in Salt Lake with 200 attendees. So we try to keep it close, and then we do formal events during that time, honoring each person in their, well, not each person, but many people in their accomplishments, or groups of people in their accomplishments. So we try to keep it alive, but as time has gone on, it gets a little bit more challenging each time, because we honestly, even at our current ages, we meet people all the time that we find out are third or fourth or fifth, sixth cousins, and then they feel left out. So you try to you just do this and hope that as many people as possible come in, and everyone gets a piece of the legacy.
I've got something to add to that reunion story. The way you know you've gotten to the right place is you see everybody maybe in a green shirt that has every surname from the family on it, like the Green Flake, the Legron, the Chambers, and so on. And it has all those names on the shirt. And you don't really know who's who. I don't. They do. I don't. But I don't know which family's which, but I don't care, because they are all so connected. And
Tanya, to be fair, none of us really, like, outside of the core people, Nicole and I will tell you, we don't know who's who.
Well,
which,
4 or 5
you know,
of
after a while, you're just like, come on, baby, come on in and get a snack.
Get a plate. That's what.
Like, well, one other experience that I had that I think sort of solidifies this whole idea of the pride in the family is when the LDS Church had the B1 celebration, and invited. I think they did extend invitations to some of your family members.
We attended. We worked with Juan Becerras of the church, the community. I don't know if you know him, but he's part of the engagement for the church, and we attended. Yeah.
So I happened to be leaving or something and ran into them in the lobby, and they wanted a picture taken of all the family members that were there that night. And so I ended up with the camera, and I clicked the picture, and I noticed there was a man behind me clicking the same picture. And I know that he had no idea who he was taking a picture of. And their cousin, Juanita, yelled and said, "Do you know who you just took a picture of?" And he said, "No." And she yelled, "It's the Green Flakes." And I just thought that explained it all, you know, the heritage and the pride in that heritage.
Mm-hmm. And yet your family, the founding members of Mill Creek, like the oldest generation there, essentially, right? And yet, Kellen, I'm just struck by your comment that changes still need to be made. I don't think we're surprised by that, but I was wondering if you could speak in a little bit, if you'd be willing to speak in more detail about what those changes might be.
Well, so since we're talking about race and segregation, I mean, Mill Creek, up until till 5 years ago, when they expanded the boundaries of Mill Creek City itself, Mill Creek was still a predominantly white middle-class community, and with pockets of minorities, often in housing, low-income housing that was brought to the east side by force. And so it's now taking those properties, those people living in those communities, and assimilating them, not just giving us a sign. And I said this to the mayor last year, it's less about a sign. I honestly don't care whether my family's name is on a sign. I want people to have access to equal education. Families that have been here in Mill Creek, such as ours, other families, we've had the opportunity to take advantage of the rising housing values. You know, if you compare it to some of the other areas that were predominantly where people of color bought homes, the home that I grew up in has a max value of about $500,000 versus the home that now sits on Mary Lucille's property and my grandma Sammy's property, which is about $1.5 million at this point. So 3 times as much value, which then gets to get used to help their family members along the way. They have access to better schools. So I think that this is where, I know Mill Creek has a program called Mill Creek Promises, and it's talking about expanding that and really giving options to these families and giving resources that will help these children that come from these families have access going forward, and potentially having the opportunities, the same opportunities Nicole and I have been afforded through the legacy of our family.
You know, Jed, I'd like to add on that too, just for a personal story about generational trauma and understanding where you come from. When I refinanced my home, I made sure that there was no personal pictures that showed that I was a Black woman. And it's been shown across the country that your appraiser will go down almost, 25 to 30 to 50% lower if they know that there's somebody of color in that house. And so I wasn't told to do that. I didn't do that because of a zoning or ordinance or a law, but that's that historical kind of understanding of perceptions and bias and how that keeps going. Because I've had people even say, well, do you want me to, my white friends, do you want me to be there to meet their appraiser? So that isn't a bias that goes into my value of my home because it's a Black woman. So I think, to your point about what changes need to be made, I need to be able to feel like I don't need to do that. That my value in my home's going to be, regardless of if it's Tanya there, you there, or Kellen or I there, that value stays consistent. And that's going to take some work.
And to Nicole's point, with refinancing, there have been a few large loan institutions that have come out and lost lawsuits showing that they have indeed offered different pricing to equal on paper, but different races. Meaning, if your credit is the exact same, my credit is the exact same as my white counterpart, I still get a higher interest rate because I've marked the box Black on that paper. And there are several large institutions that have lost lawsuits in the last 10 years. So this isn't past information.
Oh no, I will tell you,
this is recent.
My first house, I actually received the settlement from Wells Fargo, my husband and I, because we didn't know. It wasn't a big settlement, by the way, but it was because they had to pay out to anybody that had color on there, and him and, we're a biracial couple at the time. And so we received a few dollars, and that was in North Carolina. But yeah, so these are those, I totally forgot about that, but that's what happened in our first home that we bought. They had to.
So that's changes that need to happen globally, but also, in Mill Creek City and in Salt Lake City. I also think that more people becoming aware of these issues from the past and acknowledging the way that they affect us going forward. I think a lot of people like to look at issues like what we've talked about with my great aunt, and the segregation as issues of the past, but they don't really realize how that has affected families going forward. Entire generations of children may not have gone to the same schools that they might have had access to for anything other than the fact that they had a different skin tone, something that they can't change. But we tend to dumb this down in Utah. I see it all the time. Nicole and I both travel extensively. And every time I come back to Utah, it feels like, oh yeah, this is where I live again. Now, I love Utah. I've moved away. I've come back. I settled here. I'll be here for quite the time. But every time I come back, I remember, oh, we still have so much work to do.
Well, thank you. I know that you've already touched on this. I'm wondering, over the last just 10 years, let's say, Kellen, you would know the exact numbers, but property values have doubled in the last 6, 7, 8 years or something. So yes. What kind of what kind of impact is gentrification having on communities of color? Rising property value, rising, if you own a home, property value is great, I guess, ostensibly if it goes up, but you've got higher taxes to deal with. And maybe it makes it more difficult for family to move back into areas where you had once grown up.
Gentrification is a challenge. It's a very complex issue because there are positive things that come from it, such as the things that people have lived in that community have wanted for an extended amount of time start showing up. But now they come at the cost of people not being able to come back into the community. So we'll use Rose Park, for instance. There are now more than one coffee shop. Growing up, I only knew one coffee shop in Rose Park. Now there are multiple coffee shops in Rose Park and more coming. And we all know that coffee shops create community, right? Regardless of whether or not you drink coffee. And so it's starting to see those things. But gentrification also hurts those who did not get a slice of the pie, who do not have home ownership. And now they're forced out. And where do they go? Now if a community like Rose Park was affordable to them but they didn't have a car, so they were able to easily get into the city, now they're forced out of the city. And it creates a larger challenge. And Nicole can talk to that about transportation and the issues surrounding that. But it is property values, you already said this, they're great for those who already own. They're a challenge, and they're a challenge for even those who own who want to move up. I mean, if you bought a small starter home, the first home I bought in Rose Park, I paid $87,000 for it. It was worth about $140,000 at the time. It was a bank owned. I was able to fix it up over time and make it something. And I sold it years later for quite a profit. But if I didn't have that equity to move forward somewhere else, and I was trying to buy into Rose Park, that same house is going to cost me $500,000. I just sold the one across the street from it for $465,000. So I know it's going to cost me $500,000 to buy the same house I paid $87,000 for. So if you look at that from a standpoint of families trying to come back or the kids trying to be close to their parents, it's almost impossible.
Jed, one thing I'd like, two things on gentrification. Salt Lake City is doing a study on this, especially around Rose Park, North Temple, Glendale area, to see, maybe too late. If you've ever gone to Austin, you'll see what happens when everything gets gentrified. I love Austin, but you can definitely see what happens when development properties come up. So stay tuned for that. I mean, if you care about this, you want to participate in that piece. The other thing that you mentioned on, and please don't quote me on this, but I think it's something that we have to look at. The legislature has a law right now about land and taxes and losing your property. And don't quote me, I'm saying this right. But before, you had a right to get your property back. Now it's open. And so it goes back to that point of, we do have a history of someone that has lost their property from not paying their taxes. And now, instead of being notified or knowing, or you being able to do it, it goes out for bid. And so I think those are the things like you're talking about, those kind of laws, those kind of things that we have to watch as a community to make sure that we're not pushing elderly people out that are on Social Security that have to pay taxes now on something that's 10 times what they paid, or, and they can't pay for that land anymore.
To that point, oh, sorry, Nicole, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. To that point, we often hear people, now that we have an influx of people coming from California, we complain about the Californians, right? That they're the ones driving the prices up. And there's actually a fallacy to that. There's so many people coming from all over. But one thing that I think California does incredibly well with property tax is that the taxes on a property are always based on its last sold value. So if you buy a property now, it's not going to change. Your property tax will change minimally over the years, which helps low income and senior individuals stay in the homes that they purchase, which is really important to what we're talking about in generational wealth. Something I saw, and I have firsthand experience of this. I have friends who bought a property that had not been sold since 1920 something in California. So the property was paying, taxes were $3,000 total in California. And then when they closed on the property at a price significantly higher than what it would have sold for then, now the property taxes are $26,000 a year. So if you had someone who was low income buying a property, to get hit with $2,200 a month or $2,700 a month more per month on top of their mortgage than they were expecting, then, you know, obviously that's going to push them out of housing again.
Unbelievable. Well, I'll just invite anyone in who's listening in to submit a question if you have one. Maybe to sort of wrap things up. So time. Love to hear one last little story about your families. If there's something that maybe hasn't been shared or that you remember that goes down in family history or memory, I'd love to hear about it. That'd be for all three of you. Tanya, you've done lots of
Tanya probably has
research and
stories
digging.
about our family. Yeah.
Well, I have heard one story that I think is just a really sweet story. And I don't remember, Nicole, if it was your mother or someone else that said they remember staying with their grandma, with Mary Lucille, and that she would be feeding them strawberries from her garden with cream and combing her hair and telling her stories about the family. And it was such a sweet memory that she had of that happening. That's one of my.
That might have been Betty. So in that picture, it would have been the baby in the picture that you have in your article. I bet you that was Betty Juanita.
Yeah, it probably was.
And so she is the eldest grandkid to Lucille, right? Yes, that's right. I had to go through my brain.
Yeah.
And yes, she is the eldest. And so you see those generation of women there. And I think one thing I would just tell you for me, like, you have that photo and that strength of those women. And I didn't meet my great grandmother, but everybody else in that photo raised me. And I remember seeing that in my 4th grade Utah book and saying, was it 4th? No, it was 8th. I think it might've been 8th grade. And I was like, that's my family. And they're like, no. I'm like, yes, it is. It's Aunt Ruth and Nanny. And just having the pride of that, but knowing the strength that comes from that's really been great to me. And yeah, that I appreciate it. And I appreciate us taking the time to really honor them. That means a lot to me. Kellen, you have any cool stories that you can share? I know we got some that we probably should.
I was actually just sitting here and thinking about it. I think what is cool to me is being reminded, because so earlier I made reference to the cruise, and the cruise was the first family reunion after a long break. And so it was very empowering to get on that cruise ship. And Nicole speaks about the women in our family. I mean, we have some strong men, but this family has been carried by the women. It really, truly has been carried by the women. And so getting on and sitting down in a casino chair and playing till 2 a.m, you know, with my great aunts and listening to their stories and watching them light up because they're catching up with cousins they haven't talked to or haven't seen over the years. I think that was really powerful. Still is a powerful memory, especially because, like I said, we had taken probably a 10-year break from reunions at that point.
Yeah.
Well, I think I speak for everyone. It's a real honor to hear from the three of you. Thank you so much for taking the hour to share a bit about your family and your thoughts about housing and transit and race. And I do want to refer folks to Tanya's piece in the latest issue of UHQ, because it really does shed light on such an important episode. I think, Tanya, you do a really good job with it, also bringing in sort of the legacy of this family and then telling the broader story that is a Utah story about race and the struggles that we've had with it. So that is in the winter issue, and hope that we can continue this conversation, but it's great to, Kellen and Nicole, meet the two of you. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tanya, we'll see you at our next reunion, I'm sure, before
I'll
that.
be there. As long as I get the invitation, I'll be there.
We'll see you guys. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
evening.